Hey, eighth grade. Just wanted to make a quick video for the lesson. So if you're in my Thursday, September 24th or my Monday, September 28th class, this is our video. So if you missed class or you just need to go back and reference some information from the lecture, this is for you to use. So please make sure if you weren't in class that you take your attendance and do your bell ringer. You can pause the video now. Go ahead and get those done. So let's go ahead and get started on what we're going to learn about today. So we are going to focus on trade, colonial trade and government today. So this is our presentation. You also have access to this in the module. So for the Thursday class, it says Thursday, September the 24th, and for Monday's class, it'll say Monday, September 28th. So of course, you guys should already be finished with your attendance and your bell ringer. And we are going to review stuff from our last class. And then we'll move on to our lecture for this class once this slide presentation pulls up for us. There we go. So moving on. It's moving really slow. Sorry about that, guys. So today, we review our compelling question for the unit that you will be answering next week when you have your test. Why do people move? Today's supporting question: how did government and legal systems in the colonies develop? And we will be analyzing the impact of democratic principles of equality before the law, inalienable rights, consent of government, and the right to alter or abolish government. We will examine the aspects of colonial trade and colonial government and record 3 details about each, then draw conclusions about how both led to the push for colonial independence. So that's going to be our activity for today. So our bell ringer. What was the impact of the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment on colonial life? And we talked about this in our last class, and we talked about the Great Awakening being this religious movement in the 1730s and 40s in which preachers would have these large revivals, typically outside, and they would give these emotional and powerful sermons, and a lot of these were newer preachers that were not as well educated as others. And what it ends up doing is it does 2 big things. It opens up people's eyes to be more tolerant of Christian religions and Christian religions that are different than theirs. It also, because people started to run their own churches in their local communities, they begin to see that, hey, if I can run a church, why can't I have more say in running our government? So it started to have that influence as well. And then you have the Enlightenment, in which they take these scientific ideas and they apply them to the ideas of society and the way society will run. And again, what it does is begins to people start taking a more practical look at what should be happening in people's everyday life. And again, that turns into people beginning to look a little bit more towards self-governing as a way to as a better form of government. And we'll get a little bit more of that here in just a minute when we do our review. So let's go ahead and review colonial society. Remember that at the top of our colonial society and our social structure is our gentry. And this would have been our wealthy landowners, merchants, ministers, and royal officials. This would have been a very small part of our population overall, but was people that had a lot of power. And of course, like Aristotle, our middle class was our largest group in colonial America. It was the small farm owners and the less successful professionals and artisans that would have made up the bulk, probably about 75% of colonial society. We have our lower class, which would have been our farm hands and our white indigent servants and our freed African Americans. And remember that indigent servants typically would come and in payment for their passage over to the New World. They usually work 4 to 7 years. And then when they completed their servitude, they were usually given about 50 acres of land, some clothes, and some food to start off on their own. And we talked last week that social structure was a little bit more fluid, which means that people could move up and down the social structure, unlike the ancient civilizations where it was typically more rigid, and you were born into the class and you died in that class. You really couldn't move up, but that wasn't the way it was in colonial society. Though it wasn't easy, people did move up and down the social structure. And then, of course, you have the groups that are outside of a social structure. They weren't even considered part of the social structure. That would have been the enslaved Africans, which were treated like chattel, which would have been like a possession. And of course, the Native Americans who really were not treated as equals either. So, our Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, of course, like I said when we were reviewing our bell ringer, was these new and powerful preachers would inspire colonists, and instead of having these really well-educated ministers, these preachers preached more from the heart, and they talked about the connection with the Holy Spirit and with God being a more spiritual connection, and a lot of people begin to grasp at this and really made them start thinking about their own personal experience with religion. The effects were that some religions expanded, new churches began to grow, Methodist and Baptist really began to take off from this Great Awakening. People began to think of their religious tolerance and of self-rule. They ended up coming hand in hand, and so those are two of the big takeaways from the Great Awakening, which is this religious revival. It's this eye-opening experience for a lot of people in the colonies. It also helped bring the colonies together. So, to answer the big question of the Great Awakening and how it contributed to the growth of representative government in the colonies because people began to believe that they could apply their virtues used to run a church into running their government. And that's one of the reasons why there's stuff in God we trust and things like that in our government today, because a lot of the people that just developed our government would have been Christian people. So they would have taken these ideals and put it into our government. So the Great Awakening really spurns on the idea of representative government. Now, the Enlightenment. Come on. The Enlightenment was a time where people believed that reason and scientific methods could be applied to the study of society. So they started to use these logical ideas that you would use in your science and observation and applied it to the study of society. Benjamin Franklin worked tirelessly to use reason to improve the world around him. He developed bifocals and the Franklin stove, and the concept of a fire department. He urged for the paving of streets in Philadelphia, the post office, and taking libraries is not just a place that you held books, but a place that you could exchange books and actually take books out and then return them. So this was a Benjamin Franklin concept for libraries. And then we had John Peter Zenger, who was a newspaper owner who was thrown in jail for libel, which means that someone believed that he said stuff in his newspaper that shed them in a bad light and that were untruthful. Well, he had a trial and he was acquitted. So they said that he was not guilty of libel. And what this does is this ushers in this thought of freedom of press. And this would become recognized as a basic American right. So this idea of freedom of press, freedom of speech begins to come up from things like the trial of Zenger. Our dad joke of the day. What does a zombie vegetarian eat? Grains. That's awesome. That's a good one. Come on, guys. You got to laugh at that one. That's a good one. So, colonial trade and government. Here we go. Here's our guided questions. Hopefully, you'll be able to answer these questions by the end of this lecture and reading. Hopefully, you'll be able to do it. How did mercantilism develop? What is the relationship between slave trade and other forms of trade? How did government and legal systems in the colonies develop? So we looked at this image during class, and it says, examine the image of a busy Boston street. What does this tell us about the daily life in British colonies? So my class, when they started to look at this, it was a little slow. It was kind of like pulling teeth to get them to actually say something. But when they did say something, they made observations of, you see the people with the guns, and you see the cannon, and then you see people that look like they have packages or bundles of stuff that they're carrying, as well as wheelbarrows. So the normal life would have been a lot of moving stuff back and forth between merchants and the ports to be able to have stuff that is both imports and exports, but hopefully mostly exports. And we'll learn about that here in just a second. So a lot of the daily life would have been the moving of merchandise and raw materials back and forth from the ports back to the merchants. And you would have seen a lot of this in colonial cities such as Boston and Philadelphia and New York. So let's get into it. Mercantilism in the Navigation Acts. So mercantilism is the theory that a nation's economy's strength comes from the selling of selling more goods or more things than it brings in from other countries. So basically, you want to export, sell goods more than import where you buy goods. So this very much is a lot like even your own bank account. Obviously, you want to bring more income into your bank account than you take out of it. So this would be mercantilism was a very big idea for these mother countries or this colonial during the colonial era. So to do this, colonies should benefit from home country more than anyone else. So basically, let's take the model of England and its colonies. So England is the mother country, and they're trying to increase their economy and their treasury. So how are they going to do this? Well, they want to export. They want to sell more goods, and they do not want to have to import a whole lot from other people. And you want that balance to be unequal. You want more exports, less imports. And here's how this basically works. So you get colonies, such as the 13 colonies that England had, and it provides lots of raw materials: gold, silver, fur, lumber, cotton, food products. And they ship all that stuff over to the mother country. So in this case, England. What England does is they now are able to provide jobs for people to take the cotton and turn it into fabric and clothing, take the wood, turn it into boards and other things so they can build with, furs for clothing, and have food and things like that. And then what they can do with these things is they can turn around and resell them to either the colonies or to other countries. And when you do this, you're going to be able to export more than you import. This, in theory, helps both the colony and the mother country. The colony provides and the merchants can provide stuff by selling it to England. And then in return, England makes its money back by selling goods back to the colony, actually selling the finished goods. And early on in colonial times, England had a much bigger manufacturing capability than the colonies did. So a lot of times, even though materials were shipped overseas and shipped back, it was actually cheaper than buying them from the colonists because the colonists just could not make enough to actually keep their prices down. So this actually ended up being very beneficial for merchants in the colonies. So because of this idea of mercantilism and providing more exports and imports, England passed something called the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts are a series of laws that the English Parliament passed in the 1650s that govern colonial trade. So the basis of the Navigation Acts was only colonial and English ships could carry goods to and from the colonies. So all shipping had to be done by either the colonies directly or, more importantly, by English ships. They would not have wanted anyone else to be able to be involved in moving those raw materials. Now, New England really prospered from this because New England, as we learned before, one of their major things that they did was they built ships. It was a center for shipbuilding, and they were able to build ships not only for England to be able to carry goods back and forth, but also the colonists. So you had these people buying these ships. So shipbuilding was huge in New England. Also, the Navigation Acts provided a list of specific items such as tobacco and cotton that colonial merchants could only ship to England, because what England wanted to do is they wanted to control the use of these raw materials, and they wanted to take the raw materials of tobacco and cotton and turn them into products that they could then turn around and sell back to the colony or to other countries. Again, they're trying to increase the amount of exports that they have, and they wanted to control. They did not want the colonists to sell this stuff to France and Spain and other countries because they didn't want those countries being able to have access to all of these materials. This is how England becomes the most powerful country in the world, because the Americas are so rich with resources that their economy is growing huge, and they can build more warships and have larger armies and have a much bigger economy than anywhere else in the world. And they're able to eventually have a huge empire all around the world that supposedly, when it was at its biggest, the sun basically that never set on the British Empire. At least that's what they would say. Many colonists, though, begin to resent the Navigation Acts, and they would regularly break these. You need to remember that colonists often had more freedoms than the citizens in England because of this idea of self-governing. You remember the House of Burgesses and the Mayflower Compact and all that stuff. There was this root of self-governing, and because it was so far away and wasn't easy to get to, they did not necessarily have tight laws that the colonists followed, that other British people had to follow that lived in England. So what ends up happening is that people begin to resent the fact that England is trying to control them. So what ends up happening is the smuggling of cargo became a really big thing for these New England merchants, which they called Yankees because that's the nickname that they took on, and they would smuggle materials and resources to the Dutch, French, and Spanish. And the way they got around this is that they would bribe the custom officials at the port cities, because the custom officials, they were just government officials. So you pay them extra money. It gave them a better way of life. They were willing to look the other way and not inspect which ship was bringing products back and forth. So very early on with the Navigation Acts, the colonies found ways around it and found ways to break the laws, because these merchants were able to become more wealthy by dealing with more countries than just the English. Then we have our triangular trade. Now, our triangular trade basically is the idea of a trade network from the colonies in which they sent rum, guns, gunpowder, cloth, and tools to West Africa. And they would trade those items for slaves. And the slaves would then be shipped from West Africa to the West Indies. You can see it on the map here. The slaves come in here. This is called the Middle Passage, in which these slaves, hundreds of them, were just jammed into these ships, where they had to usually share bunks with 3 to 4 other people, where when they weren't sleeping, because they had to share that bed with someone else, they were usually up on the deck, poor food and very little water. And, they slept in the halls, where they would take a hall that was, you couldn't even stand straight up, and stack the beds sometimes six high. So basically you couldn't even sit up in the bed. People would be getting sick. There was a lot of human feces on the floor. So there's a lot of disease. A lot of people died. The ones that made it became slaves in the West Indies, and then from the West Indies they would take sugar and molasses, which is a liquid form of sugar, and they would send those to New England for them to create rum and other products from the sugar and molasses. So that's where we have our triangular trade from the British colonies to West Africa, from West Africa to the West Indies, back up to the British colonies. And that would be our triangular trade, with the Middle Passage, that passage so famously coined, that brought the slaves, unfortunately, over to the West Indies. Let's go ahead and watch this short video about government in the early colonies. Oops, sorry about that. Come on. Oops. Struggling, guys. Sorry. Here we go.
American colonists inherited many of their political ideas from England, where Parliament limited the power of the monarchy and granted basic civil liberties to citizens. The majority of the people in the 13 British colonies that had become the United States were English. Thus, English political traditions shaped the colonists' views on government. The idea of limited government in England had its roots in the Magna Carta, a charter signed by King John of England in 1215 to settle a revolt by many of its feudal barons. This Great Charter, as it was called, laid out important ideas about limits on government. It declared that the government could not imprison a free man or seize his property except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. Another important document in England's political heritage was called the Petition of Right. This 1628 document stated that the monarch could not impose taxes without Parliament's consent or imprison persons without legal cause, and that martial law could not be declared during peacetime. Parliament wrote the document and forced King Charles I to sign it in protest of what Parliament viewed as his abuses of power. Although Charles I and some later monarchs ignored these principles, they influenced American colonists' views of government, particularly regarding the power of government to tax. 6 decades later, in 1689, Parliament passed the English Bill of Rights, which established that people had basic civil liberties, such as the right to a fair trial and protection against excessive bail and fines, and against cruel and unusual punishment. Many of the provisions in the English Bill of Rights were incorporated into the U.S. Bill of Rights a century later. Importantly, there were many differences among the governments of the 13 colonies, but they were all guided by charters or written constitutions and had a colonial assembly elected by free men. The first elected colonial assembly to be established was the Virginia House of Burgesses, which first met in 1619. White male landowners elected the assembly, which represented geographic political districts throughout Virginia. The Pilgrims, for their part, had intended to settle in Virginia, but landed further to the north in what is now Massachusetts. Before leaving their ship, the Mayflower, the male passengers signed the Mayflower Compact. This historic agreement from 1620 was the first explicit plan for self-government in the colonies. The men pledged to become a civil body politic and abide by laws established for the colony. By the time of the American Revolution, each colony had an elected colonial assembly, a separate executive branch headed by a governor, and a system of courts. In the royal colonies, the king appointed the governor, who was chief executive of the colony and reported directly to the king. Royal governors had great authority in theory, but the vast distance from Britain and their dependence on colonial assemblies for funds limited their power in practice. Thus, much of the governing in the colonies was carried out by the colonial assemblies. Members of the lower house of colonial assemblies were the elected representatives of the voters in the colonies. The lower house had lawmaking powers, and along with the governor and the governor's council, the power to tax. The great distance from Britain and control over funds for the governor enabled colonial assemblies to exercise real political power. It was the assemblies that represented the will of the colonists.
All right. So that video did a real good job of summarizing what was going on. So let's go ahead and talk about the foundation of American democracy. So the foundation of American democracy can be found in a couple of really important documents, one of which was the Magna Carta. And you learned that that was a document from the 1200s in which assemblies and were created when the barons and the lords made King John sign it, basically giving some of his power back to the people. In the Magna Carta, what this really does is it creates a tradition of representative government. This led colonies to create legislative bodies, okay, because of this idea from the 1200s that was in the root of their beliefs as Englishmen. They created legislative bodies such as the House of Burgesses in Virginia. Now, typically, these legislative bodies would have had two houses. You would have had an upper house made up of advisors appointed by the governor, and then the lower house, which was the actual elected assembly. And you saw in the video that a lot of the governors did not have as much power as you would think they would have because of the fact that these lower houses controlled a lot of the funds, which with the money comes the real power. So it really was able to keep these governors at bay. So you could see from early on this idea of some representative government, even though it wasn't a democracy, this idea of representative government took hold from the very beginning of English colonization. And then we have the English Bill of Rights. And of course, the Bill of Rights is just a written list of freedoms that the government promises to protect. It's some of the freedoms that the English Bill of Rights protected. And the English Bill of Rights was actually came into play in 1689 when Parliament overthrew King James II and instituted William and Mary of the Netherlands as the rulers of England. And they turn around the next year and sign into law the English Bill of Rights. And what this does is it gives the rights to a jury trial. It also said that the rulers cannot raise taxes or an army without Parliament's approval. So these are actually things that you could even see in our Bill of Rights today, and within our government, with the whole idea of the jury trial, the right to a jury trial, and the fact that it's Congress that actually has the ability to raise and lower taxes, and it's Congress who gets to decide whether or not we go to war. Though there is some things that the president gets to do with vetoes and stuff, for the most part, those are powers that are given to the legislative body. Um, and then there is the commentaries on the laws of England. And what happened with this commentary is in the 1760s, William Blackstone publishes this book, The Commentaries on the Laws of England, and he looks back at the history of English law and basically comes up with the concept of this of common law. And common law is thought of as being the highest and best form of laws. And this really began to take hold in the colonies, this idea of common law. And basically what happens is the colonists start to see common law as valid and independent from the acts of parliament, which would have been the laws that they pass on the colonies. So this idea of common law really spread and really started to take root in the colonies. And this really begins to provide the basis for self-governing and independent legal system in the colonies. So you put these three important documents together, and you start beginning to see a lot of the basis and foundation of what's going on in the colonies and what ends up happening, what happens to be added into our country when we become its own country. So from these documents, you have some fundamental principles. You have the principles that government authorities come from the consent of the governed, which basically means the authority of the government comes from its people, all right, its citizens. The power of the government should be limited, and the government exists to protect the individual rights and freedoms of the people. So these are all principles that came from the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, and the idea of common law that came from the commentaries on the laws of England. So from the fundamental principles, we get some very influential and important documents for the United States. Obviously, our Constitution and our Bill of Rights and our state constitutions, all of which guarantee due process. They guarantee the establishment of the rule of law. They guarantee the freedom, free elections, and freedom of speech. And it establishes checks and balances on government authority. These are all fundamental ideas that came from these documents that came from England and Europe. So these were important parts to the foundation of our democracy. Now, as I'm waiting for this, there we go. As we know, not all people necessarily had rights. Women in the colonists had far fewer rights than freed white males. Though I will tell you that women in the colonies did have more rights than women in England did, just because of the nature of being in the colonies. But they did not have the right to vote or anything like that. Property ownership would not, though they did have the right to do some of that, not nearly as much as what a free white male would have. And of course, African Americans and Native Americans had almost no rights at all. And even if you just look at the voting rights, in most all the colonies, you definitely had to be a white male. You had to be over the age of 21 and a property owner. In some cases in New England, you actually had to be a Puritan to have the right to vote. Eventually, they do away with the property ownership, but they do keep the fact that you had to be a white male for way longer than they ever should have in our country. So women didn't get the right to vote till the 20s. Though African American men did technically after the Civil War, because of a lot of other things that were going on that we'll get to later, they really couldn't vote and were kept out of voting. So we will talk more about that in the coming months. So Now what you guys will have is you will have your reading, which we've covered quite a bit of the reading, but this will help you by going back and doing the reading. It's a very short reading. It's only like 4.5 pages. And this will help you complete your graphic organizer. So we've got a couple things here. So we have our graphic organizer that I'll show you first. You just, as you know, you can just click on this and it'll open up a copy of your graphic organizer here in just a moment. And you're going to, if I remember correctly, you're going to you're going to draw conclusions. So you're going to answer this question: how did government and legal system in the colonies develop? Your literacy skill is drawing conclusions. Use what you have read to complete the chart. Examine aspects of colonial trade and colonial foundations of government and record each topic's details. Draw a conclusion about how both led to the push for colonial independence. The first detail has been completed for you. You must complete 3 details. A lot of you guys don't want to add. This is only one of 3. So you need to come up with 2 more details about trade in the English colonies. We've given you this one. England wanted tight control over trade with the colonies so that England could profit most. And this is the Navigation Act. So I will show you guys your reading real quick, and I can show you where if you don't remember stuff from this presentation, you can see that from the reading, you can get access to this. What I would do is I would split your screen, whether it's a Chromebook and you use the Alt bracket key, or if it's a PC or a Mac and you just have to use the minimize here, you can still do it, pull the other tab over. So if you guys look, we've talked about mercantilism and imports and exports. We've talked about the Navigation Act. We've talked about the transatlantic trade. These are all things as far as the Navigation Acts and not the Navigation Act, but you could talk about mercantilism in this in your notes because that's not in there. You could talk about the triangular trade and what was traded during with the colonies, West Africa and the West Indies. And then your fundamental governments, you can talk about elected assemblies and the importance of the Magna Carta and that voting rights, who can vote, common law, and the importance of common law in the colonies. You can also talk. This one's a really big one, the English Bill of Rights, because a lot of our Bill of Rights came from that. But as you guys can see, this is not a very long reading. Make sure that you complete 3 details where you're writing a sentence or 2 for each of the 3 details. And then at the bottom, you're going to write a conclusion, 2 or 3 sentences that answers this question. How did government and legal system in the colonies develop? So you'll use this information that you're writing here to write a little summary. And that's what I have for you guys today. And I will see you guys in your next class. Don't forget that on earlier this week, I had given you guys a quiz to do. It counts as an assessment. Some of you guys did not do as well as you should have. I have opened it up so you can take it one more time. Please make sure you review your notes and do a much better job on taking that quiz. And remember that we will also have your final assessment for the unit next week as well, where we're going to have a little writing assignment where you talk about the movement of people. So I will see you guys at the next class.